Okay, day 17 solutions video. I was asked to do numbers 2, 4, 7, and 9, almost all of them. 2 I can understand, but guys, ask me questions on Google Classroom. I can give you hints instead of just at the end saying, can you do this one? Because this is nothing like we've done before. Cosine theta equals sine theta. You can move the sign over. You can't factor anything out. There's no identities, nothing to do. So I'm just going to say, let's divide both sides by the cosine of theta. And I'm going to change theta to x because it's easier to make. So 1 is equal to the tangent of theta. So we're taking the inverse tangent of both sides. So that means that the theta is equal to the inverse tan of 1. And I'm going to do the solutions on the interval from 0 to 2 pi because that's what we were doing. But I'm also going to help with the day 18s where we're doing the general form and the principal values. All right, so let's start off with the principal value. The principal values of the tangent live in quadrant 1 and 4, or it's from negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. That's the principal values. So now the tangent is positive in the first quadrant, and the tangent of 1 is at pi over 4. So if I were asked to do the principal values, my answer would be x, or theta rather, would be pi over 4. And that's it. But we were asked to do it on the interval from 0 to 2 pi, so the tangent is also positive over here in the third quadrant with a reference angle pi over 4. So 4 pi over 4 plus 1 more pi over 4, that gives me another solution of 5 pi over 4. So principal value in the interval from 0 to 360, and now the general form. And remember, the general form, if it makes a straight line, you only have to pick one of them. So x is equal to pi over 4 plus, and I just need to go pi times n, because pi will put me here, another pi puts me here, and so forth and so on. It's going to wind up and give you infinitely many solutions. So that's all there is for the general form for number 2. Okay, this is number 4, which is next, and it's quadratic, so we're going to set it equal to 0. And so it's going to be equal to sine squared x minus sine x minus 1. What I'm thinking in my head is just this. And that's what you need to see, because the sine squared of x is just a variable. So I'm going to factor this guy. And it's easy because 2 is prime and 1 is 1. So it has to be 1 and 1. And now I'm going to put a sine of x and a 2 sine of x. It doesn't matter where I put them because it's going to be the same. I just have to get my signs right because it's a negative here, so they're opposite. It needs to be a negative. So there's minus 2 sine x plus 1 sine x give me my minus 1 sine x. Sine x minus 1 equals 0, or sine x equals 1. Over here, I'm going to do the same thing. Sine x equals negative 1/2. All right, so x is equal to the inverse sine of 1, and x is equal to the inverse sine of negative 1/2. All right, where is the sine 1? Again, principal values. The sine is from negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. So my principal value answer would be right here at pi over 2. That is not number 4. But I'm going to continue with it because I've gotten this far. All right, so that's principal value would be here. There would be another value here, so this is just an example. No, that's a negative 1, so that's my only answer for this guy. Over here, where is the sign negative? The sign is negative in the fourth quadrant and the third quadrant, and the sine of 1/2 is going to have a reference angle of pi over 6. pi over 6. Principal value answer would be negative pi over 6. That's the principal value. Oops. That would not be the answer for this problem if this were our homework problem in this section, because on the interval from 0 to 2 pi, I would make it x equals 5 pi over 6, no, 7 pi over 6. And I would also make it 11 pi over 6. Okay, so this would be the three answers. These two and this one on my interval from 0 to 2 pi. This is the principal answer. In general form, I would take the three answers, and since there's nothing here to make a straight line with, this is one answer, so I'm going to add 2 pi to it. So x equals pi over 2 plus 2 pi n. This guy, since these don't make a straight line, I got to do 2 pi with both of them. X equals 7 pi over 6 plus 2 pi n, and x is equal to 11 pi over 6 plus 2 pi n. All right, I'll get 4 up. Okay, this is the real number 4. But I got a sine x and a cosine squared x. Can't do anything with that. Use the Pythagorean identity to change the cosine of x, the cosine squared of x. Remember, sine squared x plus cosine squared x is equal to 1. So I'm going to replace this with 1 minus sine squared x. That's 1 plus sine x. And we're going to set this thing equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract 1 from both sides, so that goes to 0. I'm going to subtract the sine of x from both sides. Well, no, let's go do it the other way. Let's add the sine squared over. So it's going to be positive sine squared x plus sine x. All right, so I've got two terms. I've got a common factor of the sine of x. And that's going to give me a sine x here plus 1. Okay, now that we have a factor, we're going to set each factor equal to 0. So, come on, move back up. The sine of x is equal to 0, and the sine of x plus 1 is equal to 0, or the sine of x is equal to negative 1. Taking the inverse sine of both sides, x is equal to the inverse sine of 0, and x is equal to, remember, we can also write it as arc sine of negative 1. Okay, where is the sine 0? Well, principal values for the sine are from pi over 2 to negative pi over 2. The sine is 0 right here because that's over 1 up 0. So x is equal to 0. Well, that's the principal value. That's my principal answer. If I'm doing it from 0 to 2 pi, not including 0, that means I'm going to go over here and pick up this answer at pi. So x equals pi. And again at 2 pi. All depends. The answer for this could have been 0 and pi, or pi and 2 pi. It depends what end was included on the interval that we're solving it for. But the principal value is 0. These are my two answers from 0 non-inclusive to 2 pi inclusive. Okay, now where is the inverse sine? Where is the sine a negative 1? Well, the sine is a negative 1 down here at 3 pi over 2. But if I did it for the principal value, remember the principal value ranges from pi over 2 to negative pi over 2, so my principal value here would be negative pi over 2. So that would be my principal value solution, negative pi over 2. All right, but for this problem, it's at 3 pi over 2 because it's between 0 and 2 pi. And that's the only place that the sine is negative 1. So for the interval, I would have these two and this one. In general form, this makes a straight line, so I can add pi instead of 2 pi. So I'm going to add pi to it. So x equals 0 plus 2 pi n. No, I just said I didn't have to do that. So I'm just going to add pi n, and that will give me all of them. This guy is a single answer, so I'm going to have to add 2 pi to it to come around to it again. And of course, n is an integer. Okay, number 7, I think, is fairly quick and easy. The sine squared minus 1, it's difference of squares. So it's going to be the sine, I forgot my x, sine of x, sine squared of x. So it's going to be the sine of x minus 1 and the sine of x plus 1. And that's going to give me the sine of x minus 1 is equal to 0. The sine of x equals 1. The sine of x is equal to negative 1. Taking the inverse sine of both sides, so the inverse sine of 1, and x equals the inverse sine of negative 1. All right. Principal value between pi over 2 and negative pi over 2. Where is the sine 1? Well, the sine 1 is right up here. So x equals pi over 2. That's my principal value. That's also an answer between 0 and 360. And it's the only answer between 0 and 360. All right. Where is the sine negative 1? Well, that's down here. That, for the answer between 0 and 360, is going to be 3 pi over 2. But that's not the principal value. The principal value, remember, ranges from negative pi over 2 to pi over 2, so x is equal to negative pi over 2. That's my principal value answer. This would be the answer for the homework that you did, pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. In general form, if it's one answer, you have to add 2 pi n, and this one's a single answer, so you have to add 2 pi n. The only time you can cut it down from 2 pi n to pi n is if you have two answers that make a straight line. Say this was pi over 3, and that would be 5 pi over 3. If you had that, you could write it as pi over 3 plus pi n, and that's all you'd have.